Thomas Beckett's voice cut through the conference room like a blade through silk. And the estate of Richard Moore shall be placed in trust, managed by myself and Harold Winters. I sat frozen in my chair, my black dress suddenly feeling too tight. 3 weeks. My husband had been dead for only 3 weeks, and already his lawyer was reading words that made no sense. I leaned forward, searching the papers spread across the mahogany table for my name. Nothing. My throat went dry as I finally found my voice. "What about me?" I asked quietly. Thomas looked up from the documents, his eyes cold and empty. He adjusted his glasses slowly, deliberately, like a man about to deliver a killing blow. "Mrs. Moore," he said with barely concealed contempt, "you don't deserve it." The words hung in the air between us. Harold shifted uncomfortably in his seat beside Thomas, but he didn't disagree. My hands trembled in my lap as I gripped the arms of the leather chair. I had loved Richard for 43 years. I had built his construction business alongside him from nothing. And now, in this sterile office with its expensive art and cold lighting, I was being erased from his legacy like I had never existed at all. That evening, I called Thomas's office requesting a copy of the will. His secretary, a young woman with a bored voice, transferred me directly to him. "Mrs. Moore," he said smoothly, "copies of the will are only distributed to beneficiaries." The word stung like a slap. "I'm his wife," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "That makes you his widow," Thomas corrected. "Not necessarily a beneficiary." I heard him smile through the phone. The distinction was calculated cruelty. I hung up without another word and sat in Richard's study, surrounded by his books and the faint smell of his pipe tobacco. Harold called an hour later, his tone falsely sympathetic. "Evelyn, I know this is difficult," he began. "Don't worry about the business or the accounts. Thomas and I will take good care of everything Richard built." Something in the way he said everything made my stomach clench. This wasn't grief or concern in his voice. It was ownership. Harold had been Richard's friend for 30 years, his business partner, his golfing buddy. And now he was taking everything my husband had promised would be mine. I thanked him quietly and ended the call, my mind already working through the impossibility of what I'd just heard. The law firm of Beckett and Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a downtown building I knew well. I had visited Richard there countless times over the years, bringing him lunch or meeting him after appointments. The security guard, Marcus, still recognized me even in the dim evening light. "Mrs. Moore," he said gently, "I'm so sorry about Mr. Moore." I thanked him with tears I didn't have to fake and mentioned I'd left something in Thomas's office during the will reading. He hesitated only a moment before letting me through. The hallways were empty at 7 in the evening, lit only by emergency lighting. Thomas's office door was locked, but I'd watched Richard pick similar locks a dozen times when he'd forgotten his keys. It took me 3 minutes with a hairpin. Inside, the office smelled of expensive cologne and old paper. I moved quickly to his desk, rifling through drawers with shaking hands. The top drawers held nothing but pens and legal pads, but the bottom drawer on the right side was locked with a small brass keyhole. I used the same hairpin, and the drawer slid open with a soft click. Inside, beneath a stack of client folders, was a manila envelope labeled Estate Revision Moore. My heart hammered as I pulled it free. I spread the documents across Thomas's desk under the glow of his lamp. There were 2 wills inside the envelope. The first was dated 6 months before Richard's death, written in his familiar handwriting with his characteristic sprawling signature at the bottom. It left everything to me, as he'd always promised. The second will was dated 2 weeks after his death. Impossible. My hands trembled as I held both documents side by side under the light. The signature on the second will looked like Richard's at first glance, the same looping R, the same abbreviated surname. But I knew my husband's hand better than my own. In his final months, Richard had developed a tremor from his medication. His signature had become shaky, uneven, the letters tilting at odd angles. This signature was smooth, confident, steady. Someone had forged my dead husband's will, and they'd done it poorly. I pulled out my phone and photographed every page, my hand steadier now with purpose. The trembling had moved from my fingers to somewhere deeper, a cold rage settling in my chest like ice. Thomas and Harold had rewritten Richard's final wishes after he was already in the ground. They had erased me from his life with nothing but a pen and their greed. I found the handwriting analyst through my friend Patricia, who'd used one during her own messy divorce. Dr. Mallory Chin worked out of a small office that smelled like coffee and old books. She was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. I showed her the photographs on my phone, and she studied them in silence for several long minutes. This signature, she finally said, pointing to the second will, is definitely forged. She zoomed in on the image. See here? The pressure points are all wrong. Your husband's authentic signature shows hesitation in the strokes, natural variation in letter height. This one is too practiced, too perfect. Someone traced this carefully, but they couldn't replicate the organic inconsistencies of a genuine signature. Relief and fury battled inside my chest. How certain are you? I asked. I testified to it in court, Dr. Chin replied without hesitation. This is forgery, Mrs. Moore. And not even a particularly good one. I paid her retainer fee and walked out of her office with something I hadn't felt since the funeral. Hope. Not the soft, grieving kind. The sharp, dangerous kind. The kind that comes right before revenge. I knew exactly where I needed to go next. Harold Winters lived alone in a restored farmhouse 20 minutes outside town, surrounded by land Richard had helped him buy. Harold was on his front porch when I arrived unannounced, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand despite it being only 4 in the afternoon. He looked startled to see my car pull up his gravel driveway, his expression shifting quickly from surprise to something that looked almost like guilt. Evelyn, he said, standing awkwardly. I wasn't expecting you. I forced myself to look fragile, vulnerable, the grieving widow everyone expected me to be. I'm sorry to bother you, Harold. I just don't know what to do without Richard. My voice cracked naturally. The lie tasted bitter on my tongue. He relaxed visibly and gestured for me to sit in the chair beside him. It's a difficult time, he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. But you'll learn to manage with what's left. What's left? As if Richard had left me scraps instead of a lifetime of shared work. I noticed Harold's phone sitting face up on the small table between us, the screen still lit. A recording app was running. My heart skipped, but I kept my expression neutral. Thomas said I wasn't a beneficiary, I said softly, playing my part. Harold took a long sip of whiskey and leaned back in his chair. Thomas and I made sure you wouldn't get a dime, he said, the words casual and cruel. Richard would have wanted his legacy protected from someone who never understood the business anyway. I left Harold's porch without confrontation, playing the defeated widow to perfection. But those words echoed in my mind all the way home. Thomas, and I made sure you wouldn't get a dime. He'd said it so casually, so confidently, as if I posed no threat at all, which was exactly what I needed him to think. That night, I called my niece Lauren. She was 24, brilliant, and currently finishing her master's degree in cybersecurity. Aunt Evelyn, she answered, surprised. I rarely called. I need your help with something unconventional, I said carefully. She laughed. How unconventional? I explained about Harold's phone, the recording app, and my suspicion that he kept backups of everything in the cloud. You want me to hack your dead husband's best friend, Lauren said slowly, but I could hear the grin in her voice. No, y correcte. I want you to help me ruin him. There was a pause then. I'm in. Give me his email address. Within an hour, Lauren called me back. Aunt Evelyn, she said, her voice tight with excitement. You're not going to believe what I found. Harold used the same password for everything. Whiskey 68. His birth year and his favorite drink. She'd accessed his cloud storage in under 10 minutes. There are dozens of audio files, Lauren continued, all labeled with dates. Some go back years. Lauren sent me the files, and I listened to them one by one in Richard's study, the door locked, headphones tight against my ears. Most were mundane business calls and casual conversations. But then I found the file dated 3 days after Richard's funeral. Thomas's voice came through clearly. The forgery worked perfectly. She signed the probate paperwork without even reading it. Harold's laugh followed. Evelyn never was the sharpest. She'll never know. By the time probate closes, Thomas continued, everything will be ours. The company, the properties, the investment accounts. We'll split it 60-40 like we discussed. And if she fights it? Harold asked. She won't. She's just a housewife who got lucky marrying up. Richard built that empire. She just stood next to him and smiled. My hands shook so badly, I had to pause the recording. For 43 years, I had managed Richard's books. I had negotiated contracts. I had fired incompetent foremen and hired talented architects. I had been his partner in every sense of the word, and they thought I was just decoration. I saved the recordings to 3 separate drives and called Lauren back. We need to get this to someone who can use it, I said. She was quiet for a moment then. I know a journalist who specializes in corruption cases. The email arrived in Natasha Bryant's inbox at 6 a.m. It contained audio files, photographs of both wills, and Dr. Chen's preliminary analysis. No name, no return address, just the subject line. Estate fraud in Moore case. By noon, Natasha had verified enough of the information to run with the story. The Hartford Chronicle published it online at 3 that afternoon. Prominent lawyer and business partner under investigation for forgery and estate fraud. Within hours, it had been picked up by state news outlets. My phone rang constantly, reporters seeking comment, old friends calling in shock. I let every call go to voicemail, except one. At 11 that night, a call came through from a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. Mrs. Moore, a woman's voice asked, shaking badly. This is Clara Beckett, Thomas's wife. I sat up straighter in bed, suddenly wide awake. Clara had always been quiet at social events, standing in her husband's shadow. I'd exchanged pleasantries with her at charity dinners, but never really knew her. I know what they did, Clara whispered. Thomas and Harold. I've known for months. My heart pounded. Why are you telling me this? Because they promised to cut me in, she said bitterly. 20% of everything. But now that the story broke, Thomas is blaming me. He says I must have leaked it. We met the next morning at a diner 40 minutes outside town, neutral territory where neither of us would be recognized. Clara looked exhausted, her makeup unable to fully hide the dark circles under her eyes. She slid a thick manila folder across the table to me before I'd even ordered coffee. Everything's in here, she said. Bank statements showing the transfers. Emails between Thomas and Harold planning the whole thing. Voice memos Thomas recorded outlining the forgery. I opened the folder carefully. The evidence was damning. Not just proof of fraud, but evidence of premeditation going back months before Richard's death. They'd been planning this while my husband was still alive, waiting for him to die. Why help me? I asked carefully. Clara's hands shook as she lifted her coffee cup. Because I'm tired of being married to a monster. Because they're going to throw me under the bus to save themselves. And because. She paused, her eyes meeting mine. Because what they did to you was evil. I studied her face for signs of deception, but found only exhaustion and regret. What do you want in return? I asked. Just promise me one thing, Clara whispered. Don't tell them I helped. Not until the trial. I need time to get my affairs in order. I promised, though in my mind I knew this had become something bigger than revenge. This was about justice. The arrests happened on a Tuesday morning. I watched the news coverage from my living room, coffee growing cold in my hands as cameras captured Thomas being led from his office in handcuffs. Harold's arrest came an hour later, officers showing up at his farmhouse while he was still in his robe. Both men were charged with fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to defraud. The bail was set high. Richard's name was everywhere in the news, and not the way I'd wanted. Local construction mogul's estate at center of fraud scandal. My phone rang with reporters wanting my statement, but I said nothing. The district attorney's office assured me the estate would be unfrozen pending investigation, but the process would take months. More construction. The company Richard and I had built over 4 decades was frozen in legal limbo. Our employees, good people with families, were uncertain about their futures. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table staring at an old family photograph. Richard and me at our 20th anniversary, his arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling at some joke I could no longer remember. The frame had always sat on this table, but something about it looked different now. The backing was slightly warped, the frame heavier than I remembered. I turned the frame over carefully, my hands steadier now with curiosity. The backing came off easily, and taped to the inside was a small brass key I'd never seen before. My breath caught. Richard had been meticulous about details, careful about everything. He wouldn't have hidden a key without reason. I searched the house methodically, starting with his study. Every drawer, every cabinet, every shelf. It took me 3 hours to find it, a floorboard in his study that lifted when I pressed the corner. Beneath it was a small fireproof lockbox, and the brass key fit perfectly. Inside was a leather journal, the kind Richard preferred for important notes. On the first page, in his familiar handwriting, "For Evelyn, if they ever betray you." My hands trembled as I opened it. Page after page detailed Richard's growing suspicions about Thomas and Harold. Dates, transactions, conversations that had raised red flags. Thomas suggested I update my will 3 times in the past year. One entry read, each time pushing me to name him as executor. Something feels wrong. Another entry, dated a month before his death. Harold asked about the Swiss account today. I never told him about it. How does he know? The final entries were instructions, detailed and clear, on how to access a backup account in Switzerland containing funds in my name alone. The Swiss account was real. Richard had opened it 7 years ago, slowly transferring funds that Thomas and Harold never knew existed. $2 million, invested carefully, growing steadily. All in my name. The journal contained account numbers, passwords, contact information for the bank manager. Everything I needed to access money they couldn't touch. But more than the money, Richard had documented everything. Every conversation that raised suspicion, every inconsistency in Thomas's advice, every time Harold showed too much interest in finances that weren't his concern. My husband had known something was wrong. He prepared for this possibility, left me weapons to fight back if I needed them. They think you're soft, Richard had written on the last page. They think because you smile and stay quiet, you're weak. Show them what 40 years of watching me work really taught you. I sat in his study until dawn, reading every word he'd written, understanding for the first time that Richard had seen the wolves circling long before I had. He'd left me everything I needed to defeat them. I wasn't the helpless widow they believed I was. I was holding all the final moves in a game they didn't know I was playing. The trial was scheduled for 3 months away, and I had work to do. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled and formal, with high windows that let in cold morning light. Thomas sat at the defense table in an expensive suit that couldn't hide how much weight he'd lost. Harold was beside him, gray-faced and diminished. Their lawyers were sharp-dressed and confident, the kind of attorneys who cost a fortune and specialized in getting guilty men acquitted. I arrived alone, wearing a gray dress and the pearl necklace Richard had given me on our 30th anniversary. The prosecutor, a stern woman named Catherine Wells, had told me to stay calm no matter what was said. Let the evidence speak, she'd advised. Thomas's lawyer started with character assassination. Mrs. Moore was a simple housewife who contributed nothing to her husband's business empire. This case is simply a bitter widow trying to profit from her husband's success. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, while they painted me as greedy and incompetent. Then Catherine stood and began presenting evidence. The forged will versus the authentic one. Dr. Chen's testimony about the signature analysis. The audio recordings of Thomas and Harold discussing the fraud. With each piece of evidence, Thomas's expression grew darker. His lawyer objected repeatedly, but the judge overruled him every time. Then Catherine introduced Richard's journal. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence a personal journal kept by the deceased, Richard Moore, documenting his concerns about the defendant's behavior in the months before his death. The courtroom went silent as Catherine read selections from Richard's journal aloud. His voice, preserved in ink, detailed every suspicion, every warning sign, every moment he'd caught Thomas or Harold in a lie. "If you're reading this," Catherine read from the final entry, "then they've already betrayed her. Everything I built was built with Evelyn. Every decision, every success, every dollar. They think she was just standing beside me, but she was standing with me. Don't let them erase her." Thomas's face went white. Harold stared at his hands. The jury leaned forward, captivated. When Catherine finished reading, she turned to face the defense table. "The deceased knew exactly what you were planning," she said quietly. "He left evidence because he knew his wife would need it to fight you." The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict without emotion. "On the charge of fraud, we find both defendants guilty. On the charge of forgery, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to defraud, guilty." Harold put his face in his hands. Thomas glared at me across the courtroom with pure hatred, as if I'd personally destroyed him. Maybe I had, but I felt no guilt, only a hollow sense that justice, while served, couldn't return what they'd tried to take from me. That night, returning home felt strange. The house was exactly as I'd left it, but everything felt different now. Vindication didn't taste like victory. It tasted like survival. I found the letter taped to my front door when I arrived home from the courthouse. No name, no return address, just a plain white envelope sealed with tape. Inside was a single type sentence: "You don't know everything." My stomach twisted. I stood in my doorway reading those 4 words over and over, trying to make sense of them. The trial was over. Thomas and Harold were convicted. What else could there possibly be? I almost threw the letter away, dismissing it as someone's cruel prank. But something stopped me. I'd learned over these past months not to ignore warnings, no matter how strange they seemed. The letter mentioned a name at the bottom in small print: Elise Whitman. I didn't recognize it. I searched through Richard's files, his contacts, his old phone bills. Nothing. But a quick internet search revealed an address in a town 2 hours north. Elise Whitman, registered nurse, age 56. The connection to Richard wasn't clear, but the timing of the letter, arriving the day of the verdict, felt too deliberate to ignore. I packed a small overnight bag, left a note for Lauren in case something happened, and drove north the next morning. The address led to a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, flowers blooming in window boxes, a tire swing hanging from an old oak tree. I knocked 3 times before the door opened. Elise Whitman was smaller than I expected, with graying hair pulled into a loose bun and kind eyes that widened when she saw me. "Mrs. Moore," she said softly, as if she'd been expecting me. "Please come in." Her home smelled like lavender and fresh bread. She led me to a small kitchen and poured tea, without asking if I wanted any. "Richard asked me to send that letter if anything happened to you after his death," Elise explained, sitting across from me. "He was afraid they'd come after you once he was gone." "You knew my husband?" I asked carefully. She nodded. "I was his nurse during his final hospital stay. He was very sick those last 2 weeks, but his mind was sharp. He knew he was dying, and he knew Thomas and Harold were circling." My chest tightened. "Why didn't he tell me?" Elise's expression was gentle. "He said you'd been through enough watching him deteriorate. He didn't want to burden you with his suspicions until he had proof." She stood and retrieved a small wooden box from a cabinet. "He gave me this the day before he passed. Made me promise to keep it safe and give it to you only if you survived their attempt to take everything." She placed the box in front of me. On top, in Richard's handwriting, the final account. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a thumb drive. I plugged the thumb drive into Elise's laptop with trembling fingers. The screen filled with folders, bank records, account statements, and a video file labeled for Evelyn. I clicked it, and Richard's face appeared on screen. He looked thin and tired, filmed from his hospital bed, but his eyes were sharp and focused. If you're watching this, Evelyn, then I trust you've survived their games, he said, his voice weak but steady. I'm sorry I couldn't stop them before I died, but I did what I could to prepare you. The video showed him walking me through offshore accounts he'd opened years ago, gradually moving money into my name alone. Accounts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg. $3.7 million total. All legally mine. All completely hidden from Thomas and Harold. Everything you need to rebuild is already yours, Richard continued on screen. More construction, the house, the properties, they'll all come back to you once the courts finish. But this money, this is your safety net. Your freedom. Tears streamed down my face as I watched my husband, already dying, still trying to protect me. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger at the end, he said softly. But I know you are. You always were. The video ended with him saying simply, I love you, Evelyn. Don't let them win. I sat in Elise's kitchen and cried for the first time since the funeral. 3 weeks later, I stood in front of Moore Construction's main office with a key in my hand and 47 employees watching me nervously. The courts had finally unfrozen the company's assets and returned control to me. Thomas had fired half the staff in the months before Richard's death, replacing them with his own people who'd since abandoned ship. I'd spent the past week calling back every worker Thomas had let go, offering them their jobs with raises and apologies. My husband built this company on integrity, I told them, my voice carrying across the parking lot. Thomas and Harold tried to destroy it with greed. Today, we rebuild it the right way. The crew broke into applause. Some of these men and women had worked with Richard for 20 years. They'd watched him grow from a small contractor to the biggest builder in 3 counties. Now, they watched me unlock the office door and flip on the lights for the first time in months. I wore my wedding ring again, not as a symbol of loss, but as a reminder of partnership. Richard was gone, but his legacy wasn't. When I passed the empty office that had once belonged to Harold, I stopped and spoke to the air. You were right about one thing, I said quietly. I didn't deserve his estate. I smiled. I deserved more. And now I have it. For the first time since Richard's funeral, I felt like myself again. Not Richard's widow. Not the victim. Just Evelyn Moore, business owner. The company relaunch event was held on a bright Saturday morning in May. Local press showed up, along with competitors, suppliers, and former clients who'd stopped working with us during the scandal. I gave a speech standing on a makeshift stage in our equipment yard, surrounded by trucks and machinery. My husband Richard believed that a business is only as strong as its word. I began. For 43 years, we built our reputation on honesty, quality work, and treating people fairly. Greed tried to destroy what we built, but greed failed. I spoke about the fraud, about fighting back, about the employees who'd stayed loyal through uncertainty. Thomas and Harold thought they could erase me from Richard's legacy because I stayed quiet and let Richard take the spotlight. They mistook support for weakness. The crowd applauded, but supporting someone doesn't mean being weak. It means being strong enough to share the weight. And now that I'm carrying it alone, I want everyone to know that Moore Construction will continue to stand for what Richard and I always believed in. The applause grew louder. Local news cameras recorded everything. For the first time in months, I felt proud again. Not as Richard's widow, but as Evelyn Moore, CEO. Then I saw a face in the crowd that made my smile falter. Clara Beckett, Thomas's wife, standing at the back with tears streaming down her face. She caught my eye and nodded once, a gesture of solidarity and goodbye. After the event, she approached me carefully. Clara and I stood apart from the dispersing crowd, speaking quietly while people loaded into cars around us. I needed to tell you something, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Thomas's sentencing next month, you should know the whole truth. My stomach clenched. What truth? She handed me a folder, thinner than the last one, but somehow heavier. They weren't the only ones involved in the fraud. There was someone else financing Thomas's legal defense, someone who stood to gain if they succeeded. I opened the folder. Inside were bank wire transfers, legal invoices, and email correspondence. The sender's initials appeared on every document. LM. My breath caught. Who is LM? I asked, though something cold in my chest already knew the answer. Lawrence Moore, Clara whispered. Richard's brother. The world tilted. Lawrence was Richard's younger brother by 4 years, charming and charismatic, the one everyone loved at family gatherings. He lived in California, running a real estate business Richard had helped him start 15 years ago. We'd always been close, or so I thought. Lawrence funded the whole operation, Clara continued. He was supposed to get 30% of the estate once Thomas and Harold had control. He knew about the forgery. He approved it. My hand shook so badly, I nearly dropped the folder. Richard's own brother had helped steal from me. From us. From Richard's memory. Why? I whispered. Clara's expression was pained. Jealousy, maybe. Richard was always more successful. Or maybe just greed. I flew to California the next morning, not bothering to call Lawrence first. I wanted to see his face when I confronted him with the truth. His office was in a sleek building in San Diego, all glass and modern design. His secretary tried to stop me, but I walked past her into his private office like I owned the place. Lawrence looked up from his computer, surprise crossing his face when he saw me. Evelyn, he said, standing quickly. This is unexpected. I'm so glad the trial went in your favor. He moved to hug me, but I stepped back. His smile faltered. We need to talk about your investment in Thomas's legal defense, I said quietly, closing the office door behind me. The color drained from Lawrence's face. For a moment, he considered denying it. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of options. Then his shoulders sagged. How did you find out? He asked, sinking back into his chair. Does it matter? I laid the folder on his desk. Your own brother. You helped them steal from Richard's estate while he was barely in the ground. Lawrence's face hardened. Richard always had everything, he said bitterly. The business, the success, the perfect wife. He helped me start this company, sure, but he never let me forget that I owed him. Every family gathering, every phone call, subtle reminders that I was the lesser brother. I stared at him, seeing a stranger. So, you helped steal his legacy? I helped level the playing field, Lawrence shot back. You would have been fine, Evelyn. I returned home with evidence against Lawrence and turned it over to Catherine Wells, the prosecutor. She reviewed everything with tight lips and angry eyes. This adds conspiracy charges across state lines, she said. Federal involvement. Lawrence Moore is looking at serious prison time. I should have felt satisfaction, but instead I felt hollow. Richard's own brother had betrayed us. How many others had smiled to our faces while plotting behind our backs. The trap I set for Lawrence was simple but effective. I called him, speaking in the defeated tone of a woman who'd given up. Lawrence, I know what you did, but I'm exhausted from fighting. Thomas and Harold are in prison. Maybe we can settle this quietly. I could hear the greed in his voice when he responded. What did you have in mind? There's still money in the Swiss account Richard set up. I lied smoothly. Money the courts never found. If you help me access it, we can split it and both move on. Lawrence took the bait. How much? 800,000, I said. More than enough for both of us. He agreed immediately. I'll need the account information, he said, trying to sound casual. I gave him fake credentials, close enough to the real information to seem legitimate. Just try to access it quietly. The banks are watching everything right now. Lawrence promised he would. Then he did exactly what I knew he would. He tried to access the real Swiss account using variations of the information I'd given him. The bank's security system flagged Lawrence's access attempts within minutes. 3 tries using incorrect credentials, all originating from his San Diego office. The bank immediately froze all related accounts and notified the authorities, exactly as I'd requested they do if anyone but me tried to access the funds. I forwarded the security alerts to Catherine Wells along with our recorded phone conversation. He incriminated himself perfectly, Catherine said with grim satisfaction. Attempted fraud, conspiracy, and he did it across state lines using wire communications. Federal prosecutors will love this. Lawrence was arrested at his office 2 days later. His mugshot appeared on the news that evening, his expression confused and angry. I didn't watch the coverage. I didn't need to see him destroyed to know that justice was being served. The sentencing for all three men, Thomas, Harold, and Lawrence, was scheduled for the same day. The judge wanted to handle the connected cases together. I attended the hearing alone, wearing the same gray dress I'd worn to the trial. Thomas received 7 years in federal prison for fraud and forgery. Harold received 5 years as a secondary participant. Lawrence received 6 years for conspiracy and attempted fraud. When the bailiff led them away, none of them looked at me. That night, I drove to Richard's grave for the first time since the funeral. The headstone was simple, black granite with his name and dates. I placed fresh flowers at the base and sat on the grass beside it. "We did it," I whispered to the stone. "They're all gone. The company is ours again." 6 months later, more construction was thriving. We'd landed 3 major contracts, hired back all the original employees, and expanded into sustainable building practices Richard had always wanted to pursue. I ran the company the way we'd always planned, with integrity and care. My office was Richard's old one, his desk, his chair, his view of the construction yard. I changed nothing except adding a photo of us from our wedding day, both of us young and full of dreams we'd somehow managed to achieve. One evening, as I was locking up the office, I found a letter on my desk. Plain envelope, no return address, postmarked from Switzerland. My heart skipped as I opened it. Inside was a note from Elise, the nurse who'd given me Richard's final message. "Dear Evelyn, I hope this letter finds you well and victorious. Richard asked me to send you one final message, to be delivered only after you'd fought your battles and reclaimed what was yours. He wanted you to know that your revenge was never what he hoped for. What he hoped for was your freedom." Attached was a final note in Richard's handwriting, written with the shaky hand I remembered from his last days. "You always were stronger than they thought. Use what's left not to avenge me, but to live." I smiled through tears, folding the note carefully and placing it in my wallet. My revenge was complete, but Richard was right. The victory wasn't in destroying them. It was in surviving, in rebuilding, in proving that I was never just the woman standing beside him. I was his equal, his partner, and now his legacy. I locked up the office and walked to my car in the empty parking lot, the evening air cool and promising. As I reached for my door handle, I heard it, the soft purr of a car engine stopping behind me. I turned to see a familiar vehicle, headlights cutting through the dusk. The driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out. My breath caught as recognition dawned. This wasn't over yet. But for the first time in months, I found myself smiling as I faced whatever came next. Because Evelyn Moore was done being underestimated, and I was ready for anything.